In San Jose, California, there stand a house that was never finished. Not because money ran out, not because the owner died, not because of war, fire, or collapse. It was never finished because it was never meant to be finished. This place is known as Winchester Mystery House. From the outside, it looks wrong. It rises unevenly, with mismatched roofs and towers stacked without symmetry. Windows appear where they should not exist. Some look out into walls. Others open into empty space. Doors lead nowhere. Staircases end at ceilings. Hallways twist, narrow, and abruptly stop. Inside, the confusion deepens. Rooms are built on top of rooms, then cut in half. Floors change height without warning. Corridors loop back on themselves. Nothing follows logic. Nothing follows efficiency. The house feels less like a structure and more like a maze designed to exhaust the mind. This was not an accident. This was intention. The woman behind it was named Sarah Winchester. She was not an architect. She was not an engineer. She was the widow of William Wirt Winchester, heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, the manufacturer of one of the most lethal weapons ever created. The Winchester rifle was called the gun that won the West. It was used in wars, massacres, and conquest. It reshaped the American frontier and left behind a trail of death that could not be counted. By the time Sarah Winchester inherited the fortune, the Winchester name was already soaked in blood. And then death came for her personally. Her infant daughter died first. Then her husband died of tuberculosis. Sarah was left alone, impossibly rich, emotionally shattered, and convinced that something unseen was closing in on her. At some point, whether through grief, suggestion, or belief, Sarah became convinced that her family was cursed, that the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles were seeking revenge, that they were angry, that they were countless, and that they were coming for her. According to legend, a medium told Sarah the only way to survive was to build a house that would never stop changing, a house so confusing that spirits could not find her, a house under constant construction day and night. If the building ever stopped, she would die. Sarah believed this, and so, in 1884, she bought a modest farmhouse in California, and she began to build. She never stopped. For nearly 40 years, construction continued without pause. Carpenters worked day and night. Plans were never finalized. Rooms were added, altered, abandoned. Walls were built, then torn down. Staircases were designed to confuse. Doors were placed to mislead. There was no master blueprint. Only fear. Sarah Winchester rarely explained her intentions. She dressed in black. She avoided society. She held nightly seances, alone in a darkened room, listening, she believed, to instructions from the dead. Whether she truly believed the spirits guided her, or whether this was the only structure grief could take, no one could say. What mattered was the result. A house that grew without reason. A structure that resisted completion. A monument to anxiety made of wood and nails. As years passed, the Winchester Mystery House expanded to over 160 rooms, thousands of windows, dozens of staircases, countless dead ends. Money was never a limitation. Only fear was, and fear was infinite. But the house would soon face something it could not confuse, mislead, or escape, because even endless construction cannot outrun reality forever. After the first walls went up, something changed inside the house. At the beginning, construction had followed a loose logic. Rooms were added where space allowed. Hallways connected spaces that made sense. Even the oddities could be explained as eccentric choices made by a grieving woman with unlimited resources. That phase did not last long. As the years passed, the house began to lose any recognizable pattern. It stopped behaving like a home and started behaving like a response. Every addition felt reactive, as if the structure itself was answering a question no one else could hear. At the center of it all was Sarah Winchester. She withdrew from public life almost completely. She dressed exclusively in black. She avoided mirrors. She avoided conversation. She avoided explanations. To the outside world, she became a figure of rumor and speculation, a woman swallowed by grief and wealth in equal measure. Inside the house, she followed a strict routine. Construction never stopped. Carpenters worked day and night, 7 days a week. When one crew finished for the evening, another took over. There were no final plans, no master drawings, no long-term vision. Instructions were given verbally, often late at night, and frequently changed the next day. Walls were built only to be torn down weeks later. Staircases were constructed, then altered, then blocked. Windows were installed facing interior walls. Doors were placed that opened into nothing but a sudden drop or solid wood. To anyone trained in architecture, it was madness. To Sarah Winchester, it was necessity. According to those who worked for her, Sarah held nightly seances in a small, dimly lit room. She sat alone at a table, writing, listening, and waiting. What she believed she heard during those hours shaped what the carpenters built the next morning. Whether these seances were spiritual rituals, coping mechanisms, or something closer to obsessive compulsion remains unclear. Sarah rarely spoke about them. When questioned, she deflected or fell silent. But the house spoke clearly enough. The number 13 appeared everywhere. 13 steps on staircases. 13 panels in windows. 13 hooks in closets. 13 drains and sinks. To some, it suggested superstition. To others, ritual. To Sarah, it may have been structure in a world that had lost all stability. As the house expanded, it became increasingly difficult to navigate even for those who built it. Carpenters reported getting lost in rooms they had worked on weeks earlier. Corridors looped back unexpectedly. Doors led into spaces that no longer existed. The house resisted familiarity, and that resistance was intentional. Sarah believed the spirits that haunted her were intelligent, persistent, and angry. She believed they could follow. She believed they could learn. And so the house had to remain one step ahead, constantly changing, constantly misleading. Not to trap the spirits, but to exhaust them. The longer the house grew, the more isolated Sarah became within it. She moved between rooms using private passages and hidden stairways. She slept in different locations each night. No one knew where she would be at any given hour. The house was not just her shelter. It was her strategy. Outside, the world modernized. Electricity spread. Cities expanded. The Winchester Company continued to profit from conflict and expansion. Inside the house, time behaved differently. There was no sense of completion, only continuation. Money flowed into the structure endlessly. At its peak, the house contained more than 160 rooms, thousands of windows, dozens of staircases and corridors that served no purpose except confusion. Entire wings existed only briefly before being altered or abandoned. The structure was not evolving toward something. It was running from something. And yet, for all its movement, the house could not escape the one force Sarah feared most: silence. The construction continued for nearly 40 years, but Sarah herself aged. Her health declined. The seances grew longer. The instructions grew more erratic. The house became denser, heavier, more difficult to change. The very strategy meant to save her was becoming a prison. Rooms piled onto rooms. Floors sagged under the weight of indecision. The maze grew tighter, less flexible, less responsive. The house was still changing, but it was no longer agile. It was slowing down, and when it finally stopped changing, something fundamental would break. Because the Winchester Mystery House was never built to stand still. For decades, the house had been in motion. Walls shifted, rooms changed, corridors were rerouted. The structure never rested long enough to settle into a single form. It adapted constantly, as if movement itself were a form of protection. Then, on the morning of April 18th, 1906, the ground moved instead. At 5:12 a.m., Northern California was torn open by one of the most powerful earthquakes in American history. The San Francisco earthquake rippled outward with catastrophic force, collapsing buildings, igniting fires, and killing thousands. The Winchester Mystery House did not escape. When the shaking began, the house reacted violently. Towers swayed, walls cracked, chimneys collapsed. Entire sections of the upper floors tore away from their supports, and fell inward. The very features that had made the house confusing now made it fragile. Rooms stacked without logic shifted against one another. Staircases twisted. Load-bearing assumptions failed instantly. What had been eccentric became dangerous. When the shaking stopped, the house was wounded. One entire wing collapsed. The famous 7-story tower, already unstable, was reduced to 3. Hallways were crushed. Windows shattered. Doors that once led nowhere now led into piles of debris. The maze had been interrupted. Sarah Winchester survived the quake, but something fundamental changed that morning. For the first time in more than 20 years, construction stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Carpenters were dismissed. Tools were left where they fell. Instructions were never given. The constant noise of hammers and saws, the sound that had defined the house's existence, vanished. Silence moved in. Sarah believed the earthquake was a message, not from nature, from the spirits. To her, the destruction was not random. It was punishment, a warning that she had failed to listen, failed to follow instructions precisely, failed to keep the house moving fast enough. In response, she did something unexpected. She sealed the damaged sections. Instead of rebuilding the destroyed wing, Sarah ordered it closed off entirely. Doors were locked. Hallways were boarded up. Staircases were blocked. What had collapsed was not repaired, it was entombed. The house did not heal. It scarred. From that point forward, the Winchester Mystery House split into 2 identities. The outer portions continued to exist, altered but functional. The inner core, once central to the maze, became inaccessible, frozen in time at the moment of collapse. Rooms sat dark and unreachable. Furniture remained where it had fallen. Dust settled and was never disturbed again. The house stopped listening. Construction resumed in limited form, but it was no longer relentless. The pace slowed. The changes became smaller, less ambitious. Sarah grew older, weaker, more withdrawn. The nightly seances continued, but their urgency faded. Fear remained, but control did not. The earthquake had done something Sarah's endless construction never could. It had imposed finality. Not total destruction, but boundaries. There were now places in the house that would never change again. For a structure built to avoid stillness, this was catastrophic. As the years passed, Sarah moved less. She confined herself to familiar rooms. The vastness of the house no longer protected her. It overwhelmed her. The maze that once confused imagined pursuers now confused only its creator. The house had outgrown its purpose. When Sarah Winchester died in 1922, the construction ended permanently. No one picked up the tools. No instructions followed. The workers left for the last time. The house finally stopped. What remained was a structure mid-thought, a sentence cut off before its end, a response frozen in place after decades of motion. The spirits Sarah feared never came to claim her, but the house she built to escape them was left behind, unfinished, unstable, and permanently altered by the moment it could no longer change. When Sarah Winchester died, the house did not react. There was no collapse, no sudden silence, because silence had already arrived years earlier. No dramatic shift. Construction simply did not resume. For nearly 4 decades, the house had existed in a constant state of becoming. Workers came and went. Walls moved. Floors changed. Nothing was fixed long enough to feel permanent. And then, without ceremony, that motion ended. The tools were put down for the last time. The hammers stopped. The sawdust settled. The Winchester Mystery House stood exactly as it was, unfinished, unresolved, and filled with decisions that no longer had a living reason behind them. Almost immediately, its meaning began to change. What had once been a private response to grief and fear became a public object of curiosity. Relatives moved through the rooms, trying to understand what they had inherited. Investors walked the corridors, measuring square footage that defied logic. Architects examined staircases that violated every rule they knew. No one could explain the house in practical terms. So explanations drifted elsewhere. Stories began to solidify, not slowly but eagerly. The narrative of spirits, curses, and endless construction spread far faster than any verified account ever had. The idea of a haunted house was simpler than the reality of a grieving woman with unlimited resources and no constraints. The house was open to the public. Almost immediately, it became something else. Rooms that had once been private shelters turned into exhibits. Dead ends became attractions. Staircases to nowhere became talking points. Guides learned which details captured attention and which could be ignored. The house was no longer running from fear. It was being interpreted through it. Visitors walked the maze looking for meaning. Some came for history. Others came for mystery. Others came hoping to feel something. Unease, dread, confirmation that the house was more than wood and nails. The structure encouraged projection. Every strange feature became intentional. Every odd choice became supernatural. Windows placed in walls were no longer architectural mistakes or last-minute changes. They were traps for spirits. Doors opening into nothing were no longer accidents of construction. They were deliberate misdirections. The house did not correct these assumptions. It allowed them. Behind the guided paths and curated explanations, vast portions of the house remained sealed. Rooms untouched since the earthquake. Corridors no longer safe to enter. Areas frozen in darkness, dust thick enough to erase footprints. These spaces fed the myth more than any tour ever could. The idea that something was hidden. The idea that something remained unfinished for a reason. The house became less about what could be seen and more about what could not. Over time, the Winchester Mystery House stopped being treated as architecture at all. It became narrative space. A place where grief, guilt, superstition, and American violence could be folded into a single story. A woman haunted by the dead. A fortune built on weapons. A house built to confuse spirits. It was clean. It was unsettling. And it was easy to repeat. The more complex truth that the house was the product of isolation, trauma, and endless decision-making without limits was harder to sell. It required empathy instead of fear, context instead of legend. Legend won. As decades passed, the house settled into its role. Maintenance kept it standing. Selective restoration preserved its strangeness without resolving it. The maze remained intact, not because it was necessary, but because it was expected. The house had become performance. And yet, beneath that performance, something remained unchanged. The structure was still unfinished, still contradictory, still resisting explanation. No amount of storytelling could make the house feel complete. No tour could give it a proper ending. It existed permanently mid-thought, a physical manifestation of anxiety interrupted by death. The Winchester Mystery House did not become famous because it was haunted. It became famous because it never arrived anywhere. In that unresolved state, the feeling that something had been left hanging, unfinished, unanswered, continued to draw people in long after Sarah Winchester was gone. The house no longer needed her fear to sustain it. It had learned how to survive on its own. In the end, the Winchester Mystery House did not reveal a secret. There was no final message hidden in its walls. No single room that explained everything. No moment where the maze resolved into meaning. The house simply remained. As the decades passed, the stories surrounding it grew louder than the structure itself. Ghosts replaced grief. Curses replaced context. Fear became easier to sell than loneliness. The legend hardened until it became more real to the public than Sarah Winchester ever had been. But the house never confirmed any of it. It stood quietly, unchanged in its refusal to make sense. What visitors felt inside the Winchester Mystery House was not supernatural presence. It was cognitive dissonance. The discomfort of moving through a space that had no hierarchy, no destination, no clear intention. A building that never guided, only reacted. This was not the work of spirits. It was the result of endless choice without resolution. Sarah Winchester had built without stopping because stopping meant finality. Completion would have meant accepting loss, accepting death, accepting that no amount of construction could reverse what had already happened. So the house kept moving. And when it finally stopped, when death removed the last decision maker, it froze in place exactly as it was. Not as a monument, not as a warning, but as evidence. Evidence of what happens when fear is allowed to dictate structure, when wealth removes friction, when isolation replaces dialogue, when grief is given tools but no boundaries. The Winchester Mystery House does not trap spirits. It traps attention. It draws people in because it mirrors something deeply human, the impulse to keep rearranging the world rather than confront what cannot be fixed, to add corridors instead of choosing an ending, to build complexity instead of closure. That is why it feels unsettling, not because it is haunted, but because it is unfinished. The house never learned how to end, and neither, in many ways, did the country that created it, built on expansion, on constant motion, on the belief that progress is always forward, never inward. The Winchester Mystery House reflects an America uncomfortable with stillness, uncomfortable with loss, uncomfortable with limits. So it stands, maintained but unresolved, visited but not understood, explained but never answered. A structure that confuses not because it was designed to, but because it was never allowed to conclude. Sarah Winchester feared the dead. What she built instead was a house that refuses to rest. And in that refusal, the Winchester Mystery House became something more lasting than any finished mansion ever could. Not a ghost story, a portrait of avoidance. Still standing,